Blog Talk Radio.
Yikes, I had my line muted. Sorry about that, folks who could not pick me up. People that were on the horizon heard me. This is Gus T Renegade, context of White Supremacy. I'm not going to repeat everything I said, but basically the gist of it, this program is a retrospective on the March on Washington, the August 28th, 1963 March on Washington, looking back, basically doing this program in a compensatory spirit. I feel like many people who know a little bit about the civil rights movement, and I do mean a little bit, they really haven't done thorough investigation of what took place. And it's a real tragedy because there's a lot of rich material around what happened at the march and different perspectives that you're just not going to hear, that white people have done a really good job of erasing, throwing in the trash, hoarding away so that they know about it, but black people are ignorant about it, and I think that is a real travesty, and I think it has an unfortunate adverse impact on our ability to counter racism, white supremacy, because we don't really understand everything that went around the march, what went into it, and the dissenting opinions, both before the march and after. People who did not think it was something to celebrate, people who did not think it was, one of the most joyous and momentous moments for black people attempting to counter racism, white supremacy. So my apologies if you could not hear my voice for a minute. That was my error. I had tapped my mute button accidentally, but that should be cleared up. You should be ready to rock. This is going to be a lot of reading. I'm not going to do a lot of talking because really it's already been said. I think several folks have commented repeatedly. We do not have to reinvent the wheel. That is definitely the case for anyone who wants to offer any criticism around what took place at the March on Washington. A plethora of folks have already put it down and said it way better than I can say it. And even if I did think I could say anything well, there's really no need. I can just lean on, you can always lean on giants and folks who have come before you, the ancestors, and given their 2 cents on what happened. And in this case, I think that's even better because these folks are contemporaries. A lot of the folks that I'm going to read and share with you, these folks were at the march. They participated. Either they were a part of the planning of the event, or they at least were there as spectators, or they simply were alive at that period of time, black folks working against racism, white supremacy, and had their own view on what took place. So I'm going to hop right to it. If you're listening to the broadcast, if you don't think what you're hearing is of constructive value, I guess you can let me know. And if you're called in, you can press 1 and say, that's kind of whack, that's kind of boring, not feeling it, and no worries, my feelings will not be hurt. Other than that, I think we're going to get ready to get started. I am going to perhaps play the clip because it might not have been heard. I will perhaps play the clip again that I started the program with because I think that is appropriate, and then I will get to the reading. So I'll do it one more time because I think I did make that error and have my mute button pressed. So I'll play it again right now so you all can catch the way we began the program. People listening at War on the Horizon, they heard this, but for everybody else, I'll play it one more time just so you get the spirit of how this program began.
Signed the Emancipation Proclamation that freed the slaves. 200,000 people converge on the nation's capital to rally for civil rights. They come by train, they come by bus and by air. They come from the north, the south, the east, and west. They come united in one cause, to urge Congress to pass a civil rights bill to end forever the blight of racial inequity. By 11:30, there are more than 200,000 thronging the mall, a crowd that is bigger than the most optimistic forecasts. Now there's a growing animation. It seems as if the demonstrators were finding strength in each other and discovered their cause was a bond. Arrests in Washington were below normal. Police attribute this to the fact that for the first time in 30 years, you couldn't even buy a beer in Washington. The civil rights marchers needed no stimulants like that. They provided their own, with songs that ranged from the sacred to the hillbilly, but with the one recurring theme, the cause of 20 million Negroes. Washington, D.C., 1963. Democracy speaks in a mighty voice. we rolling this way. That March in 1963, that's a bit of nonsense. We ain't rolling like that no more. Matter of fact, the Yo Black America, we rolling up with seminars, press conferences, and straight up rallies. Am I right? For people, we got the gift coming to us. Word up. We ain't going out like that 63 times. Of course. Playback.
Context of white supremacy. I don't think most people have seen that or heard that. That is from the extended video of Fight the Power, Public Enemy. That's on the soundtrack for Do the Right Thing. If you get the collector's edition of Do the Right Thing, that video is on that DVD. It's on YouTube as well, but I don't think most folks have seen that. Very important that that video begins with archival footage from the March on Washington, and then Chuck D referencing the march as nonsense. I think as we progress through the program, you'll get a better understanding of why. I would agree it is nonsense, and it's racist white supremacists at their refined best. That's what the March on Washington represents to me. So we're going to get right to it. I'm going to read the quote from the description for folks who did not catch it because it's super important, and it's from one of my favorite books and authors, C.O.W.S, his book 2000 Seasons. It is in my top 5. Extraordinary read. Yeah, that book had a big impact just on my understanding of racism, white supremacy, and it helped me break with Christianity. I grew up in the Christian church, unfortunately. Reading that book really helped kind of sever my ties with all that and help kind of de-trash my mind from the programming of racism, white supremacy. The quote that's in the description, "For whose entertainment shall we sing our agony? In what hopes shall the destroyers aspiring to extinguish us suffer conciliatory remorse at the sight of their own fantastic success? The last imbecile to dream such a dream is dead, killed by the saviors of his own dream." C.O.W.S, 2000 Seasons. I would highly recommend that book. As I said, it is one of my favorite books that I've ever read. It's all about racism, white supremacy. He is an African author. Man, I'm going to quote him again as we roll through the program. But first thing that I want to read, as I said, I'm not even doing a whole lot of talking. I am going to share my view from time to time, but I am going to do more reading this program because we do not need to reinvent the wheel on this one for sure. I've mentioned this article several times, and white people have such tremendous technology because of the system of racism, white supremacy. They were able to get me a PDF of this article for free. So I want to read it because I know a lot of us, we do not like to read. I've been told that's one way that you can encourage reading in children is to read to them, particularly if you can read things that are of interest to them. So hopefully that will be the case. If not, if you find it boring and of no value, feel free to find another program or what have you. Don't want non-white folks wasting time. This is the report, the August 28th March on Washington, the Castrated Giant by Mike Thelwell. I've referenced this report several times. I think the article is fantastic. It was published in 1964 in Presence Africaine. Anybody, if you would like your own copy of this, I have a PDF of it so I can email it to you. So if you shoot me an email, I can send it to you. No worries. Just let me know if you think it would be of value, something you would like to have. I can get it to you. I can say this report probably is a little difficult to find unless you are near a solid university where they probably have the Presence Africaine Journal. But I'm going to read the entire report. It's about 18 pages, so it will probably take me a few minutes to get through it. I'm going to get some water, and hopefully you'll find it interesting. I've read this report many times, and I think it's fantastic, and it will be a great way to begin the program. So this is from Mike Thelwell. The now historical March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was in many ways a social phenomenon that could have taken place, as the Reader's Digest is fond of saying, only in the United States. The true significance of what happened in Washington on that day defies any simple definition. What really happened on that tortuous road that the march took to Washington will probably never be made public. This is unfortunate because somewhere along the twisting road that stretched between the first ideas for the march and the abortion of those ideas that was finally delivered in Washington on August 28th lies the corpse of what could have been a real step forward in the struggle for Negro rights in this country. It would be useful, especially to Negroes involved in this struggle, to know just who was responsible for what happened to the march and to know what forces were at work. What kinds of pressures and bribes were tried and by whom? It would be important to know what deals were made and who made them. Which of the many compromises were the results of inevitable social pressures and which were forced by the power machinations of the Kennedy administration? Which decisions were sincere mistakes of timidity and of judgment, and which were deliberate attempts to reduce the whole operation to impotence? It would be useful to know, for example, what the real role of the middle-class Negro organizations was in this event and whose interests they imagined themselves to be representing, and whose interests they did, in fact, end up representing. It would help us to know these things, but for understandable reasons, the people who have the information that would indicate these things are silent. But there are some things that are public, like what happened. This whole world saw, and some of these leaders did make public statements that said more than the words spoken. On the day itself, as the far-flung tentacles of the sprawling organization that had materialized around the idea for the march came together, it was clear to observers that something significant was happening before their eyes. The nature of what was happening was not then and is still not now clear. On the one hand, there was an undeniable grandeur and awesomeness about the mighty river of humanity, more people than most of us will ever see again in one place, affirming in concert their faith in an idea and in a hope that is just. And on the other, there was an air of grotesquerie, as in some kind of carnival where illusion is the stock in trade, an impression given sustenance by the huge green and white striped carnival tent and the hordes of hucksters peddling gaudy March pins, pennants, tassels, and similar items more readily associated with sporting events than with serious social protest. It was a day of contrasts, a day of platitude and rhetoric juxtaposed with genuine passion and real anguish, a day of bitterness and disappointment for some and of hope and inspiration for others. One looked into the black face of a Southern sharecropper, weathered and marked by privation, yet on this day filled with hope and pride and the belief that a new day was indeed coming. Then one looked at his son, 16 years old, fresh from the brutality of a Southern jail, who did not need the abstractions about oppression and intimidation because his own body bore their marks, and one could not but share in the bitterness in his eyes. And if one looked from these two to the small army of propagandists wheeling cameras and masses of equipment around, intent on recording this day as some kind of triumph for the system that had oppressed these people, one could not escape the feeling that somewhere there had occurred a subtle and terrible betrayal. Because this day that had promised so much was too sweet, too contrived, and its spirit too amiable to represent anything of the bitterness that had brought the people there. And while the goodwill and amiability of the marchers surmounted race and class and was a heartening thing, there was an overhanging atmosphere of complete political irrelevance. As originally conceived, the march was to come at the climax of the most tumultuous summer of Negro militants in the history of the country, and was to have been the largest single demonstration of social discontent that the government had ever known. When I heard the plan articulated for the first time, and it was still embryonic then, I was told that waves of nonviolent demonstration of civil disobedience were planned to completely immobilize the Congress. The militant student group, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, was already thinking out stratagems to get huge numbers of demonstrators into the halls of Congress. This is forbidden by law, and the plan was to replace the demonstrators with another wave as soon as the first was removed, and to keep this up until the jails of Washington were filled. Simultaneous with this action, there were to be sit-ins in the offices of the Justice Department protesting that agency's failure to protect the constitutional rights of Negroes in the South. Similar sit-ins were planned for the offices of certain politicians from southern states where the constitutional and legal rights of Negroes were being and are now being violated each day by local authorities as a matter of official policy. All these activities, which were to be done by the same people who were then manning the lines in demonstrations all over the country, were to be auxiliary to the huge body of the march, which would break no laws but would come to Congress and present to it a petition for the redress of 300 years of wrongs. The civil disobedience aspect of the demonstrations were intended to dramatize the situation of the Negro. Negroes were there offering their bodies to the jails because in this country they are in jail, because they are not citizens and are not really represented by Congress, because they have no voice in the decisions that govern their living and their dying, and because they have been traditionally and deliberately excluded from full participation in the social process of the country in which they were born. Civil disobedience was central. Laws are for those who make them and who give their consent to them and are protected by them. On this basis, Americans, white and black, fought one revolution, and the Negroes, by symbolically defying the laws as they had been doing in small communities throughout the South, were again affirming that government without representation is tyranny, and the attack was to be directed to the seat of government, as that is the symbol and residence of power and represents the entire system that persecutes us. The goal was social dislocation without violence. This is the underlying technique that informs all direct action projects in the movement towards justice for America's disinherited blacks. It is one of rendering the institution under pressure inoperable by the presence of determined black bodies. When demonstrators descend on any establishment, the purpose is to so disrupt its functioning as a segregated institution that it will become non-functional and be forced to close and reopen on an integrated basis. So in one sense, the demonstrations are aimed at destroying institutions that function unjustly and replacing them by a different institution in the sense that the same restaurant, once integrated, has become a new entity in terms of its function. This was not the idea for the march. since the goal was not to attempt a permanent dislocation of the Congress, but merely to use this kind of pressure for one day. This was in May, and planning was geared towards having this action during the congressional debate on the civil rights legislation that President Kennedy had decided to introduce, largely because of Ole Miss and Birmingham. Certain questions were still to be resolved at this time. The penalty for disrupting the functioning of the Congress is a sentence of up to 5 years in jail. Could, from among the thousands of Negroes who were at that time involved in demonstrations all over the country, a sufficiently large number be found who were willing to risk this long sentence? Was it justifiable to ask them to do this? Where would the money come from to stage the kind of complicated and expensive legal battle that would be required to free the demonstrators afterwards? Would the authorities use force to break the demonstrations up? This is the pattern in the South, but not in Washington, D.C. But neither is it the pattern to allow demonstrations aimed at Congress. In 1961, when 120 students from Howard University attempted to picket on the steps of the Capitol, the police broke the demonstration up with the threat of the 5-year sentence. On the other hand, there was a question of whether Kennedy would risk the kind of adverse publicity that would result in the demonstrators were forcibly removed from the halls of Congress. It has been this administration's posture abroad that it is committed to equality for all Americans. The reality is that it is committed to political expediency and to containing the Negro militants by conciliation. Would it have risked giving the lie to its official image by a picture on the front pages in Africa and Asia showing 10 resisting Negroes being dragged from the steps of the Capitol, the American symbol to the world of democracy and justice? The other alternative would be either to head off the march by making real concessions to Negro demands, or else to allow civil disobedience without any police action that might have triggered off violence. The demands of the march were to be, number one, full employment for all Americans of both races and an appeal for a massive federal program to train all unemployed in meaningful and dignified jobs at decent wages. Number two, integration of all public schools by the end of this year. Number three, federal fair employment practices law outlawing all job discrimination. 4, passage of the Kennedy administration's legislative package without compromise or filibuster. As it turns out, the administration was spared to having to make this decision. I remember leaving the conversation where the original plan for the march was told to me. I said to my friend, who was to play a central role in organizing the march, "I've told you that when the revolution comes, it will be the Negroes who begin it." This was a joke between us, but only partially so, because we were agreed that at the time when the Negro succeeded in forcing the power structure of this country into revising its practices and this society into amending its traditional attitude of exclusion and exploitation towards him, its effects would be so far-reaching and profound as to completely remake society. It is still my conviction that this is so, because no one can look at the deeply entrenched tradition of racial injustice in America and imagine that any gradual evolution of justice is possible. It will take traumatic action of various kinds to wrench society out of the deep channels of segregation in which it moves, and which causes this evil to recreate itself. Early this year, a group of Negro students were told by a Negro official of the federal government that the latter could do nothing to enforce fair employment on one of its contracts, because the kind of extreme action that this would require in the face of the long history of exclusion would disrupt too many powerful groups within the society. That bureaucrat really meant that the federal government could take this action, but that it would not. But this illustrates why any meaningful integration of the Negro will be accompanied by social tension, chaos, and will result in the restructuring of the extant social patterns. In this sense, it will be revolutionary, in quotes, in the deepest sense of that term. Every Negro leader except Roy Wilkins and Whitney Young, who has felt the burden of this systematic cultural policy of exclusion, knows that he cannot integrate into this society but into a new, decent one that will have to be created from energy that must be initiated by the Negro people. For this reason, the language of every Negro leader, even those that are incredibly conservative on all other political issues, is couched in the idiom of revolution whenever he talks about integration. Minister Malcolm X, the fiery and witty leader of the Black Muslim movement, which bases much of its social ideology on the impossibility and undesirability of integration and appeals for complete separation, sums up the totality of the Negro's exclusion in these terms, in quotes. Martin Luther King says that we are second-class citizens. That is not true. We are not citizens at all. The fact that we were here before 1776 and that we are born here does not make us citizens. A cat can have kittens in an oven, but does that mean they are biscuits? It was this entrenchment of discrimination that led me to speak in terms of the revolution, and this is why I favored and still do favor the tactic of disobedience to the civil law on the march and the use of aggressive nonviolence. If these original plans had not been abandoned, a crisis might have been forced. The mere threat of using 5,000 veteran demonstrators who had known jails and police brutality from demonstrations in cities like New York, Birmingham, Cambridge, and Danville, Virginia, and Negroes from the Deep South, where the state quite literally represents a monopoly of violence against the Negro, may well have been enough to pry some action from a reluctant Congress. The history of the United States Congress over the last 100 years is a history of racism. It has never acted in the interest of the Negro unless it was forced into doing so by political pressure. Like any other institution, its reactions are geared to practical considerations and self-interest, and not moral imperatives. Therefore, its actions tend to ride on the coattails of public opinion, which means in this country, white opinion and national prejudice. As a body, it will do nothing for the Negro that is likely to move against the mainstream of social momentum. This unwillingness to act for integration is compounded by the structuring of that body, which places Southern politicians who represent areas in which Negroes are effectively disenfranchised at the head of influential parliamentary committees. Thus, Congress is in great measure controlled by men who derive their power from segregation and to whom integration on a political level means the end of the system that brought them to power. The presence of these Dixiecrats in the Democratic Party and the essentially schizophrenic and bastard nature of that party within which an allegedly liberal president must live with the most reactionary forces in this country is one more indication why the Negro's posture towards the political establishment must be one of attack. It also indicates why no meaningful legislation can be induced out of Congress with its present political composition, and why the march was originally conceived not as an appeal to conscience, but as an expression of strength. Such a demonstration was outlined, would not have attracted anything like the 250,000 people who attended on August 28th, but there can be no doubt that it would have received widespread support. This was the Negro mood at that time. Newspapers and TV news programs were filled with the story of the Negro uprising, in quotes. Demonstrations were erupting in the streets of cities across the nation, North and South, within a period of 2 weeks after the march was first mentioned to me, upheavals were recorded in cities as far apart as Albany and Americus in Georgia, Greenwood, Goldsboro, Jackson, and Oxford in Mississippi, and in cities in Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, the Carolinas, California, and the border states of Virginia and Maryland. Before the summer was over, outbreaks of varying degrees of violence were to shatter the northern complacency of cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. In Cambridge, Maryland, some of the most critical confrontations took place, and the possibility of a racial war was sufficiently present to warrant the imposition of martial law. In Danville, Virginia, the tactics used by police to break up nonviolent demonstrations were more savage than in Birmingham. On the 10th of June, of 64 demonstrators, 40 required medical attention after club-wielding police and deputized garbage collectors followed blasts of water poured from fire hoses into the group, clubbing women and children indiscriminately and strewing the street with bloody, soaked bodies. One result of this was 3 days later, the demonstrations included 250 Negroes. These two instances illustrate the all-pervading nature of the oppression of Negroes here. I chose them because they are both located within a few hours' drive of Washington, D.C., but similar instances of this nature can be found all over the land. After the much-publicized Birmingham demonstrations, the Negro mood hardened perceptibly and became more abrasive and determined. There was more bitterness and less patience. There were also more demonstrations. On these mornings, a glance through the newspapers, which generally subdue their reports of racial unrest, revealed that Negroes, like the spring, were breaking out all over. Even from the relatively neutral reports, it was evident that the mood of these demonstrations was changing. Incidents of Negroes facing up to the police and to white mobs were more frequent. In the streets, the bars, the homes, the churches, the mood ebony was clearly one of indignation and open anger. The landlady of a friend of mine, a lady of some 65 years, and up until then, a veritable stereotype of the respectable, religious, and passive older generation of lower middle-class Negroes, began to seriously investigate the possibilities of purchasing a revolver. This new mood did not escape the white press, nor did politicians miss it either. Great concern was expressed about the possibility of a major race riot or a series of race riots sweeping the country. President Kennedy had publicly affirmed the right of peaceful demonstrations earlier in the spring. Now, moved as much by the Southern and conservative charges that he was encouraging anarchy as by the possibility that Negro people would retaliate in kind to their attackers, he took the position that although legal, demonstrations were irresponsible and that Negroes should return their battle to the arena of the courts, which was, among other things, less visible. The position of the student demonstrators was that there was nothing to be gained by keeping the illusion of peace. There is no real peace where there is no justice, and the white man's peace is for us a slave's peace. The demonstrations did not stop. In this position, Kennedy was supported by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, whose National Secretary, Roy Wilkins, publicly questioned the effectiveness of street demonstrations. There are two important considerations which militate against this position. One, the simple fact that the white establishment's wish to stop demonstrations is the best possible brief for their continuance. If it becomes sufficiently threatened, it will remove the causes of the demonstrations. The other factor is that discrimination does not exist because of any absence of law-affirming Negro rights. It exists in spite of such laws and the Constitution because the federal administration has never acted to enforce these laws, which are blatantly broken and ignored unless some kind of crisis seems imminent. Therefore, it is not more laws that are needed, but more pressure. In 1954, Supreme Court decision on segregated schools directed the integration of the entire school system with all deliberate speed. Nearly 10 years later, there has been little more than token observance of this ruling in the South. One answer is direct action, and even with the schools, this is possible. In Englewood, New Jersey, Negro parents took their children out of the Negro kindergarten and into the white school where the children had not been permitted to enroll. The teachers attempted to ignore these illegal infiltrators, but the white infants did not, and after 3 days, the teachers found it simpler to include the demonstrators in the class activities. In Boston, Negro citizens set up freedom schools and withdrew thousands of Negro children from the official high schools in protest of the inferior facilities given to Negroes. The freedom schools included in their curriculum classes in the theory of civil disobedience, social responsibility, and Negro history. The Boston school system hastily came to terms with the Negro community. The plans for this march were evolved by Bayard Rustin, a Negro militant and pacifist and admitted homosexual, Tom Kahn, a white student in a Negro university who was a young man with a long history of civil rights activities, and Norman Hill, an executive of the Congress on Racial Equality, CORE, a militant direct action group. Rustin is one of the most colorful characters in the civil rights movement. In addition to being an astute tactician and extremely politically sophisticated, he is one of the few real intellectuals that is active. He is essentially not a leader figure, but there is no one person who has had more direct effect in defining the direction that the struggle has taken in recent years. He was an executive assistant to A. Philip Randolph in planning the March on Washington for the integration of war industries during World War II. He was Martin Luther King's advisor during the Montgomery bus boycott, the director of the Youth March on Washington for Integrated Schools in 1954, and has organized nonviolent demonstrations in Tanganyika and in England, and 3 years ago led a party of Africans into the Sahara to protest against French nuclear bomb tests. One of the reasons he is not a publicly acknowledged leader in this struggle, and this does not speak too well of the courage existing groups, in his association with the American Communist Party during the Depression. But he is certainly the person with the most realistically radical approach to the struggle and one of the few adult voices that the students in the struggle respect and will listen to. Another such person is the novelist James Baldwin, Cowbell Ring, and he is also an admitted homosexual. Main opposition to Rustin as organizer of the march came from Roy Wilkins of the NAACP. That huge middle-class base and essentially conservative Negro organization. Wilkins is the, in quotes, Negro leader most appreciated by the middle-class Negro and white liberal community as being responsible, end quote. He is roundly rejected by the students as a tool of the white power structure. It is difficult to understand how anyone can be naive or nearsighted enough to demand sweeping changes in the area of Negro rights in a country where any meaningful demand on behalf of the Negro is radical and yet hold conservative attitudes towards all other areas of society. The Negro student's attitude towards Wilkins would be one of pitying disregard, except for the fact that he is so potentially dangerous to real progress. The consistency with which he echoes the Kennedy line has become a joke since Negro students have no faith in Kennedy. It is my own feeling that any Negro leader who depends solely on the goodwill and friendship of political manipulators, the likes of John Kennedy, is a millstone around the neck of the people he is supposed to represent. When I left Washington in June, the plans for the march were not yet made public, and it was my understanding that the first steps were already underway. A. Philip Randolph was approached and was willing to call on other 5 civil rights groups to participate. Since the appeal was for jobs and freedom, it was felt that organized labor should be involved. Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which had spearheaded the Birmingham demonstrations, committed itself to the idea eagerly. CORE, another militant organization, and the one responsible for the 1961 Freedom Rides, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is a student organization which specializes in working only in the deepest South, were also eager to support the march in its unadulterated form. However, the heads of the NAACP, Urban League, the 2 most affluent and respectable of the civil rights organizations, withheld their support on the basis that it did not appear to be worth the effort or the money. It should be pointed out that the support of these 2 organizations was considered essential for reasons of politics and finance. From this point on, the march plans were subjected to the bewildering succession of changes, disputes, and distortions that resulted in the final fiasco that took place on August 28, 1963. One meeting of these leaders was described to me in these terms. Well, we finally pinned Wilkins of the NAACP down and finally wrung a commitment from him. By this time, he had held up the campaign for several weeks, but the support of the NAACP and Urban League was on the condition that civil disobedience was abandoned. The first compromise was made. There were to be no sit-ins, pickets, or aggressive activity of any kind. The next issue was a strong objection to Rustin as the deputy organizer. Randolph and King were adamant on this point, and Rustin's services were retained. My next information was to the effect that although the march was not officially announced, the Kennedys knew about it, and it was in the wind that the administration was against it. The committee was having difficulty in getting support or money. You would be surprised, my informant concluded, how liberal doors close in your face when Kennedy is opposed to a project. Shortly thereafter, there was a public announcement, and Kennedy publicly disapproved of the idea. A Negro clergyman in New York declared that there was going to be a massive acts of civil disobedience, prostrate bodies on streets and airport runways and railroad tracks, massive and monumental sit-ins at the Congress. The white community was unanimously horrified. It then became a matter of public discussion that SNCC and CORE were preparing for nonviolent civil disobedience, all-day sit-ins at the Justice Department, in Senator Eastland of Mississippi's office, and in the Congress. The country's reaction was, as nearly as I could observe, one of apprehension, if not open fear. The events of the early summer and spring, especially those in Birmingham, that's the water hoses, dogs, little kids, that's what they're talking about, had convinced them that the Negro community was about ready to retaliate in kind. Bloodbaths were predicted should the march take place. The committee for the march and the leaders of the Urban League and NAACP singly denied any plans for direct action, and CORE and SNCC were chastised for, in quotes, irresponsibility. I was told that the Kennedy administration was putting up unbelievable opposition and that the administration maneuvering was fantastic. I was not told, nor did I ask, the nature of this opposition. However, after the official rejection of any kind of civil disobedience, public opinion began to veer. The entire idea of the march was no longer condemned as un-American, and groups not normally active in the Negro cause began to hint at support. Liberal colonists began to remember that the Negro had the force of morality and a history of persecution behind him. But the powerful Labor Federation, the AFL-CIO, still refused and never came out in support. Shortly thereafter, the announcement came of the rerouting of the march. Instead of going to the Capitol legally and petitioning Congress, the march would now proceed from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial and listen to the speeches of the leaders. The leaders alone would visit the politicians. Plans to include 2 unemployed Negroes in the meeting with the president were quietly forgotten. I do not know that they were ever officially changed, but I do know that no unemployed persons made that visit. With this new announcement, President Kennedy underwent a sudden and dramatic change of heart and publicly welcomed the march as an expression of support for the legislation that the events of the summer had convinced him to introduce. From this point on, the march became more of an expression of faith in the Kennedy administration. The changing of the route had guaranteed that the whole proceedings would be as unobtrusive as possible and that it could be isolated to one small and relatively unimportant section of Washington. It was the second week of August before I was able to get to New York. Despite severe doubts about having anything to do with this march, I found myself being pulled, possibly by curiosity, to its headquarters. There, the truth of the assertion that Americans love a parade was made evident. There was a great willingness to support the project. The phones buzzed with supporters of this social revolution, in quotes, to complain that the bus that my bridge club has chartered has no air conditioning, or that our buses have no reclining seats. One group wanted to know if they could carry signs bearing Talmudic inscriptions and whether their leader could make a speech or see the president. Others wanted to know if they would lose a day's pay by attending. In the New York headquarters, I found many students whom I knew. Their attitude was one of expectant excitement. They were all veterans of the struggle. Most had prison records as a result and were sufficiently aware as to have few illusions about what their relationship as young Negroes was to their environment. Knowing this, I had difficulty determining how they could lend their support to what the project had become. That question is still largely unanswered, but I suspect that the answer has much to do with a personal loyalty to Rustin and the manner in which any activity can generate around itself a force and an energy that completely immerses anyone who is in too close proximity to it. For the students, the problem became one of obtaining 6 more buses, trying to get a train or getting letters out, and in the solution of these individual problems, the validity of their total strength passed unnoticed. The scene at Washington's March headquarters ranged between irony and absurdity. The entire town buzzed with activity and speculation. The newspapers were filled with little else. In the office, the volunteers of both races, by some queer coincidence, became divided into what appeared to be racial groupings: whites to the north, Negroes to the south. This proved to be the result of coincidence and a personality conflict between 2 organizers rather than any racial tensions. Quite obviously, the march was the best thing that had happened to private enterprise and small business in Washington. 3 days before the event, private entrepreneurs started selling the march pins, pennants, and other assorted souvenirs that they had the foresight to have made. It was a triumph of American ingenuity, and I calculate that the March Committee lost many thousands of dollars to these opportunists who undersold the official March prices for these items. Very clearly, the agents of the government were under orders to cooperate with the workers. One student volunteer received a traffic ticket while driving a March car. The police captain promptly tore the ticket up. This apparently insignificant incident represents a fraudulent inversion of normalcy, which can be understood if you know that the student had been a companion assaulted, that the student had seen a companion assaulted 2 months before by Washington policemen when they protested against brutality in the arrest of a Negro prisoner. He was arrested off a picket line a week before in Washington because of the intimidating, in quotes, nature of the sign he carried. The cooperation of various groups was, to say the least, surprising. Huge, luxurious, and air-conditioned cars were loaned to the committee. 2 of these came from a firm that had been picketed by CORE that summer because of alleged discrimination in their hiring policy. So much sweetness was generated, in fact, that one woman's conscience was moved. She wanted to help, although her attitude towards Negroes had not been the best in the past. She had this huge house, so she decided she'd take in marchers. She phoned the housing committee. Yes, that's right. I can give housing to 20 marchers. Yes, that's right. 20. Anything to help a good cause. But one thing, would you please see that you only send me white marchers? This is all in quotes. But it was most nauseating at the headquarters tent that was pitched by the Washington Monument. White tourists forsook the tour of the monument to photograph and gape at the volunteers at work making signs. The government photographers shot miles of film. They often interrupted the work to pose the volunteers so as to integrate, in quotes, the work team. Now smile, they said, this is going to Africa, in quotes. So it happened that the Negro students from the South, some of whom had still unhealed bruises from the electric cattle prodders which Southern police used to break up demonstrations, were recorded for the screens of the world, portraying American democracy at work. The sweetness and light was so all-pervading, and the smiling official faces so numerous, that one student volunteer remarked to me, "It's incredible. Look how cooperative they are. When the revolution comes, the government will be cooperating with the revolutionaries," in quote. He was wrong. Whenever it appears that Negroes are about to change the shape of things and to effect a more equitable distribution of power and privilege, and this is what any kind of Negro freedom in America will require, the real racism will emerge in the form of guns, clubs, police dogs, and the violent suppression that happened in Danville and Birmingham. The march no longer had pretensions of doing that. However, amid this ocean of goodwill, 1 or 2 local whites maintained their perspectives. On the night of the 26th, the telephone cables into the headquarters tent were cut. On the morning of the 28th, some of the buses en route to the demonstrations were stoned. The American Nazi Party contributed their usual racial abuse until one of their number was arrested. On that morning, a young Virginian was arrested while driving towards the crowd carrying a sawed-off shotgun. One was almost grateful to see these people for reaffirming reality. Little needs to be said of the events of the day itself. One white marcher gives this account. From the headquarters tent, they began passing out the placards. They must have had 10,000 of them, all neatly lithographed, each bearing one of 5 officially approved slogans, such as, "We march for jobs for all. If you want a sign, please step up," said a young woman, and the people who had come so far stepped up and were given their officially approved signs. "Do you want a program?" asked a busy lady in white, and she made sure that the people who had come so far each had a mimeographed program showing them which way to the march and telling them how to behave properly. And afterwards, through the long, hot afternoon, we stood in front of the stolid memorial while they sang at us and spoke to us of equality and justice, all, it seemed, in officially approved words. And through diligent organization and scrupulous planning, they managed to stage a mass protest against injustice without offending anyone. I suppose that this is necessary, but I am sad. I had high hopes, and I came away sad. I find it sad to live in a society where a man demanding individual freedom must march into battle carrying a mimeographed map and under lithographed banner showing an officially approved slogan. And I feel deeply that in some way I don't fully understand the people who had come so far had been betrayed. I want to make sure I read that again. And I feel deeply that in some way I don't fully understand the people who had come so far had been betrayed. These are sentiments that are quite understandable. But suppose the writer, instead of being a white Californian, had been a Negro student out of a Mississippi jail. There are two events from the day that are illustrative. James Lee Pruitt is an 18-year-old Mississippi Negro. He worked on voter registration for SNCC. His job was to organize Negroes to make the attempt to register. It is a dangerous and frustrating work. One student, Jimmy Lee, was shot in Mississippi for doing this 2 years ago. At the march, Pruitt was stopped by one of the marshals whom the committee had provided to keep the peace. "Has that sign been approved?" asked the marshal. "It's my sign," Pruitt said. He was led silently to the chief marshal for judgment to be passed on his sign, which simply said, "Stop criminal prosecutions of voter registration workers in Mississippi." This was something that young Pruitt understood since he had recently spent 4 months in a 5-by-8-foot cell along with 14 other SNCC workers. In the jail, they had been kept without any clothes for 47 days and had the fans trained on their small cell. Pruitt had been placed into a tiny zinc cubicle set in the Mississippi sun until he passed out after 12 hours with a reported temperature of 104 degrees. When one of the group fell ill and the services of a doctor were requested, the guard said only, "Sure, nigger, after you are dead." During his trip to Washington to carry that sign, the car that he was traveling in developed mechanical trouble. No garage in town would touch the car, and it had to be abandoned. Pruitt was one of those who had come so far and at great price. It could not have been much consolation to him that the chief marshal, after hearing his story, decided that he had a right to carry the unofficial sign. And this story, while extreme, is symbolic of a great many who had come a long way and at great sacrifice, whose stories were not told and whose anguish was not expressed on that day. There is a small footnote to the Pruitt story. Yesterday, November 15th, I heard from a SNCC field secretary that Pruitt was again in Parchment Farm, the Mississippi penal farm of folk song and legend. The other story concerns another young Negro whose name is John Henry Lewis. He is the 25-year-old national chairman of SNCC, the outfit to which Pruitt belongs. He has been arrested in the South more than 25 times, and the day of the march was one of the few times that I have seen him without some kind of bandage on his head. He was listed on the mimeographed program as a speaker, and when he spoke, he would tell some of the truth, and at least the stories of the Pruitts would be heard. Of this we were sure. However, a copy of his speech was seen by the Catholic Archbishop of Washington, Patrick O'Boyle, who decided that the speech was inflammatory and refused to give the invocation unless it was revised. Over the strong objections of Lewis, supported by Rustin, pressure of the other leaders carried the day and the speech was changed. The final chapter in Irrelevance was written. The people who had come so far were to get dreams and visions and rhetoric. Here is some of what Lewis was to have said. Listen, Mr. Kennedy. Listen, Mr. Congressman. Listen, fellow citizens. The black masses are on the march for freedom and for jobs. We will march through the South, through the heart of Dixie, the way Sherman did. We shall pursue our own scorched earth policy. We shall take all matters into our own hands to create a new source of power outside of any national structure, to splinter the segregated South into 1,000 pieces and put the pieces back in the image of democracy. So there is much to be sad about as regards to the magnificent abortion of August 28, 1963. It is sad that at the end of so much activity, the best and worst that could be said is that it was orderly and no one was offended. It was much sadder and a little obscene that if anyone gained from the day's activity, it was the United States Department of State, which converted the proceedings into a great propaganda victory. When the Telestar broadcast of the march was suddenly and inexplicably canceled by Russian TV, this was hailed by the American press and by the State Department as evidence that the Russians were afraid to show their people this example of democracy in action. But even if this is true, who does this help? Could they not afford to allow their people to see this mammoth crowd of free people in a free society petitioning their government for the redress of wrongs? No explanation has been offered as to why a free people should need to march for freedom, or why, if the government is really theirs, i.e., really represents them, it has made no move to redress these wrongs. This exploitation of so many angry and sincere people, whose indignation was misrepresented as some kind of testimonial for the system that had oppressed them and against which they were protesting, must qualify as one of the greatest and most shameless manipulations of recent years. But the really terrible thing was that the march became a symbol and a focal point in the minds of Negroes during this explosive summer of our discontent. And in many communities where the Negro temper was right and where there had been meaningful protest activity, the militants were diverted into mobilization for the march. In one community, the local student group was told in June that the most important activity they could undertake was to make the march preparations their summer project. This was before the emasculation process had begun, and these students decided to set aside their local program and to work towards this end. This happened in too many areas. Local action slowed down, and we all looked to Washington for the climax that never came. In this way, much energy and much anger were wasted on the spectacular. Ironically, what was to have been our day of protest served a similar function to the bread and circuses of the Roman emperors. It drained the anger of our people into irrelevant channels. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., after his famous dream speech, is reported to have exulted, "We have subpoenaed the conscience of the nation. There is reasonable doubt that this conscience exists to be subpoenaed. But there can be little argument with Malcolm X's remark that while the Reverend King is having dreams, the rest of us Negroes are out here having nightmares." This is perhaps what happened on August 28, We All Had a Nightmare. Again, that is Mike Thelwell. The title of the piece is The August 28th March on Washington, the Castrated Giant. If anybody would like that article, I can get it to you. I hope it was not a waste of time to read the whole report, but I think because so many of us don't read and we don't investigate, we miss a lot of information, and I just think it's important to get that article was published in the winter of July 1964, like January, February of 1964. So felt it was important to get that out. If you didn't think it was important, my bad. Hope you didn't have to sit through it. I want to play a sound clip, and then I am going to come back and offer a thought or two. But this sound clip, I won't even set it up. I'll just play the sound clip, and I'm pretty sure you can put the pieces together on your own.
Maybe your teacher wanted something else.
Like what?
Well, hey, you could have written more about the people, why they got involved and what they felt. I can tell you what they felt. Hot. Yes, it was rather warm that day.
We were lucky. We were on an air-conditioned bus, and all of them didn't have it.
Not many buses, just hundreds and hundreds of them.
And the singing.
Yes, the singing. You could hear the singing coming from every bus. We sang all the way down there.
Not everyone was singing. Please don't start off.
Just tell your father he's quiet.
You ought to tendency to drag out the words and sing off. What really happened besides the heat and the singing?
Theo, I'll tell you what you should put in that paper. The mood of that day. Oh, Theo, it was so friendly. Yes, it was.
People we didn't know at all, waving to each other like they were old friends. We were old friends by the time we walked from the parking lot to the
a couple of miles at least. We had to march to the march.
Just all kinds of people, all colors, from every part of America.
They carried signs and they wore buttons to let you know where they come from.
I traded buttons with a man from Portland, Oregon.
Walked around all day long with his button on. Kiss me, I'm Irish. You're so bad. Your father went around collecting buttons all day long. Every time I look up here, on new button. Kiss me, I'm Jewish. Kiss me, I'm Polish. Kiss me, I'm Japanese.
And I still have those buttons up there.
Oh, we have a whole drawer full of reminders of that day.
It must have been great knowing you guys were going to be part of history.
Oh, no. That wasn't what it was about. We were just expressing the way we felt.
But when we stood in the church parking lot waiting to get on the bus, there was only about 50 of us there. I looked around and I thought, well, what if we're the only ones who show up?
We were a very small group of people. Yes, till we got down there. There were so many people to stand in front of the Washington Monument surrounded by 250,000 people to be heard. Theo, your granddad and I met this one woman, Nadine.
She was 71 years old. And
I was talking.
I was just telling the boy about Nadine.
But I was telling him about Nadine.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, you. Will somebody please tell the boy? I'll tell him. Nadine was 71 years old, and she drove all the way from North Dakota.
Grandfather.
She drove down with the granddaughter.
Lovely child.
During the march, Nadine was with us every step of the way.
Every step.
She stood through all the speeches and never sat down once. We were amazed a person her age could do all of that.
That's so. She was the same age then that you are now.
Oh, you're right. No wonder she could do all that.
See, Theo, that's the one thing that you can't get in the history books. That's the one thing you can't capture. The people.
I guess so.
And you should have seen what it was like when we went back to the bus.
Right. People held hands, smiled. There was joy and pride, and other newspapers said there was going to be trouble, but there wasn't any. It was lovely, peaceful.
It was peaceful. I still carry a little of that day.
Dr. King said, I don't think I'll ever forget. In a sense, we have come to our nation's capital to cash our check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American
was to fall in. This is great. I didn't have to go to the library after all. All I had to do was have dinner with my family. Hey, wait. Up in the bottom drawer of your mother's dresser, pictures, old newspaper clippings.
Your father's kiss me buttons are in there, too. I'm glad Bill had that paper to write. It brought back a lot of memories.
It certainly did.
Russell, do you remember someone sitting way in the back of the bus starting to sing? Mine eyes seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on.
Glory, glory,
Hallelujah. Glory,
August 28th, 1963 was the day that changed my family. It was a day of joy and pride, and most of all, hope.
His truth is wise.
The government has failed us. You can't deny that. Anytime you live in the 20th century and you walking around here singing, "We shall overcome," the government has failed. This is part of what's wrong with you. You do too much singing. Today it's time to stop singing and start swinging.
Context of white supremacy. The clip you heard from The Cosby Show, the title of that episode is The March. It is from Season 3, Episode 6. It originally aired on October 30th, 1986. I guess my thoughts would be, I would rather have Sarah Susan Setti than The Cosby Show. If I was to be real honest about how I feel about The Cosby Show, I'd rather have Sarah Susan Setti than The Cosby Show, just for that right there. And I mean, I have a lot of gripes about The Cosby Show, but they never talk about racism, ever. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that, I'm willing to go and watch all 8 seasons of The Cosby Show and pick out, just to make sure, but I watched enough of it to know that I never, ever, 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 ever heard anyone make a gripe or complaint about white people being racist on that show. To my knowledge, that episode, and there's another episode, it's titled Vanessa's Bad Grade. It was from Season 2, Episode 12. It aired January 16th, 1986. At the end of that episode, I think it aired on the King holiday, and they played the speech, the I Have a Dream speech, as the episode closed. The whole family is around watching the television screen. Those are the only 2 times that racism ever comes up. I find it to be incredibly disingenuous, dishonest, and just a total fabrication. If the only mention of racism, white supremacy is the March on Washington, that is a total disgrace. And as I would prefer Sarah Susan Setti to The Cosby Show. Bill Cosby is he is a victim of white supremacy, but he's not stupid. His wife is reported to be a big fan of Dr. Kenneth O'Reilly's book, Racial Matters, the FBI's secret file on Black America from 1960 to 1972. So it's not like he's totally uninformed. If this is the only mention you can make about racism, white supremacy, I either conclude you are really ignorant and uninformed, confused about racism, white supremacy, or you are trying to willfully deceive people about the nature of racism, white supremacy. Those are the only 2 conclusions I can come to. At any rate, I'm not saying I'm not doing this program to bash on Martin Luther King Jr. or anyone else. It really comes down to two principles. Number one, I think it's very dangerous to put non-white people on a pedestal. We are all victims. We all make mistakes. We all make errors because of this system. It's not about praising anyone. It's really just about recognizing what that person did. If they did something constructive that you can use, pick that out. If they made some errors and things that supported the system of racism and white supremacy, you want to pick that out too. And from what I have seen, and white people have done a lot, they've invested a lot of energy in making sure that this happens. Black people have a real fascination about that march and about Martin Luther King Jr. That, in my view, it does nothing but aid the system of white supremacy. It steals that impatience, the militancy that black people should have, and just a general understanding that white people are committed to maintaining this system. They're not going to stop. They're not going. Even if they hold hands and go out in the street and jump up and down about Oscar Grant, that's totally irrelevant. They will go home and continue to do everything possible to maintain their system. They'll come out and march with you for a little while for Jenna Six or Sean Bell or Oscar Grant or whomever the enforcement officials gun down tomorrow, Ayanna Jones or anyone else, and keep right on rolling, telling their racist jokes when they get back home and doing everything else. And I think that needs to be overstood by black people, non-white people worldwide and immediately. Now back to the march. And I said there's a lot of material. There's a ton of material about this. I'm just trying to hit as much as I can, and then I'll get to the phone lines because a lot of people called in. This is from, I hope, something that, most people who are listening to this program have read, the autobiography of Malcolm X, the chapter on Icarus, the chapter titled Icarus. Page 282, he says, nothing since Joe Louis has coalesced the masses of Negro groups, the masses of Negroes. Groups of Negroes were talking of getting to Washington any way they could, in rickety old cars, on buses, hitchhiking, walking even, if they had to. They envisioned thousands of black brothers converging together upon Washington to lie down in the streets, on airport runways, on government lawns, demanding Congress and the White House some concrete civil rights action. This was national bitterness, militant, unorganized, and leaderless. Predominantly, it was young Negroes, defiant of whatever might be the consequences, sick and tired of the black man's neck under the white man's heel. The white man had plenty of good reasons for nervous worry. The right spark, some unpredictable emotional chemistry, could set off a black uprising. The government knew that thousands of milling, angry blacks not only could completely disrupt Washington, but they could erupt in Washington. The White House speedily invited the major civil rights Negroes. They were asked to stop the planned march. They truthfully said they hadn't begun it. They had no control over it. The idea was national, spontaneous, unorganized, and leaderless. In other words, it was a black powder keg. Any student of how integration can weaken the black man's movement was about to observe a master lesson. The White House, with a fanfare of international publicity, approved, endorsed, and welcomed a march on Washington. The big civil rights organizations right at this time had been publicly squabbling about donations. The New York Times had broken the story. The NAACP charged that other agencies' demonstrations, highly publicized, had attracted a major part of the civil rights donations, while the NAACP got left holding the bag, supplying costly bail and legal talent for other organizations' jailed demonstrators. It was like a movie. The next scene was the Big Six, civil rights leaders meeting in New York City, while the white head of a big philanthropic agency. They were told that their money wrangling in public was damaging their image, and a reported $800,000 was donated to a United Civil Rights Leadership Council that was quickly organized by the Big Six. Now, what had instantly achieved black unity? The white man's money. What string was attached to the money? Advice. Not only was there this donation, but another comparable sum was promised for some time later on after the march, obviously if all went well. That original angry march on Washington was now about to be entirely changed. Massive international publicity projected the Big Six as March on Washington leaders. It was news to those angry grassroots Negroes, steady adding steam to their march plans. They probably assumed that now these famous leaders were endorsing and joining them. Invited next to join the march were four famous white public figures, one Catholic, one Jew, one Protestant, and one labor boss. The massive publicity now gently hinted that the Big Ten would supervise the March on Washington's mood and its direction. The four white figures began nodding. The word spread fast among so-called liberal Catholics, Jews, Protestants, and laborites. It was democratic to join this black march, and suddenly the previously march-nervous whites began announcing they were going. It was as if electrical current shot through the ranks of bourgeois Negroes, the very so-called middle class and upper class who had earlier been deploring the March on Washington talk by grassroots Negroes. But white people now were going to the march. While some downtrodden, jobless, hungry Negro might have gotten trampled, these integration-mad Negroes practically ran over each other trying to find out where to sign up. The angry blacks' march suddenly had been made chic. Suddenly it had a Kentucky Derby image. For the status seeker, it was a status symbol. Were you there? You can hear that right today. I think you heard that in the Cosby Show of all things. It had become an outing, a picnic. The morning of the march, any rickety carloads of angry, dusty, sweating, small-town Negroes would have gotten lost among the chartered jet planes, railroad cars, and air-conditioned buses. What originally was planned to be the angry riptide one English newspaper aptly described now as the gentle flood. Talk about integrated. It was like salt and pepper. And by now there wasn't a single logistic aspect uncontrolled. The marchers had been instructed to bring no signs. Signs were provided. They had been told to sing one song, "We Shall Overcome." They had been told how to arrive, when, where to arrive, where to assemble, when to start marching, the route to march. First aid stations were strategically located, even where to faint. Yes, I was there. I observed the circus. Who ever heard of angry revolutionists harmonizing "We Shall Overcome" someday, while tripping and swaying along arm in arm with the very people they were supposed to be angrily revolting against? Who ever heard of any angry revolutionists swinging their bare feet together with their oppressor in lily pad park pools with gospels and guitars and "I Have a Dream" speeches? And the black masses in America were and still are having a nightmare. These angry revolutionists even followed their final instructions to leave early. With all of those thousands upon thousands of angry revolutionists, so few stayed over that the next morning the Washington Hotel Association reported a costly loss in empty rooms. Hollywood couldn't have topped it. In a subsequent press poll, not one congressman or senator with a previous record of opposition to civil rights said he had changed his views. What did anyone expect? How was a one-day integrated picnic going to counter-influence these representatives of prejudice rooted deep in the psyche of the American white man for 400 years? The very fact that millions, black and white, believed in this monumental farce is another example of how much this country goes in for the surface glossing over the escape routes, surfaces instead of truly dealing with its deep-rooted problems. What that March on Washington did was to lull Negroes for a while, but inevitably the black masses started realizing they had been smoothly hoaxed again by the white man, and inevitably the black man's anger rekindled deeper than ever, and there began bursting out in different cities in the long, hot summer of 1964 unprecedented racial crisis. That is, again, from chapter titled Icarus in the autobiography of Malcolm X. There's two things I wanted to point out. Number one, that passage, Malcolm X talks eloquently about how rhetoric and slick words were used to lull and confuse black people into thinking that something more was taking place at the march, to thinking that this was something that was really going to improve things for them and stop white people from practicing racism, and nothing could be further from the truth. As I said, I really just want to do a lot of quoting some folks who have already commented on this. We don't need to reinvent the wheel with regards to the March on Washington at all. This is a quote from, again, one of my favorite authors, Ayi Kwei Armah, African author. This is from an essay that he wrote. It is titled A Mystification, African Independence Revalued. And I mean, I'm going to have to read this really slow so you don't miss it. Just marinate on this and keep in mind the March on Washington. Marinate on this. I'm going to read this real slow. The constituents, being provincial peoples, are very definitely under the metropolitan language, the verbal technology of their conquest. They seldom have enough experience with it to understand more than a few sloganized chunks of it, and their ability to communicate in it is cretinous compared to their handling of their own languages. Secondly, the politicians and leaders in the elite are themselves mostly also under the metropolitan languages, though they may not realize this as readily as their provincial constituents. For the most part, the official speeches and publications put out by the elites have a high proportion of slogans, cliches, and not very well understood verbal formulae. With an ongoing imperial system, the use of metropolitan word power in the provinces tends to be not pragmatic, but magical. That is, effects produced on provincial crowds subjected to speeches in metropolitan languages are likely to come more from a fascination with forms and cadences than from any appreciation of realizable content. Content counts for little. Form is almost everything. Again, that is Ayi Kwei Armah from his essay, A Mystification, African Independence Revalued, 1969. He was talking about black people in different countries in Africa and how they struggle understanding English. In some areas it's French. Basically, he's talking about their struggles understanding white people's language and how they can put out a black person who can put together some cute-sounding phrases and what have you, and that confuses them and makes them think, oh, he's going to be doing something for us. In actuality, they didn't really understand what he said at all, and they just got a few chunks that made them feel good for a little while. I think the exact same thing can be said of the March on Washington and maybe even black people in general. I would even say all that hoopla in the 2008 presidential election about hope and change. sounds a lot like exactly what Mr. Armand was talking about in the passage that I just read, the verbal technology of our conquest. I'll leave it at that. I'm going to see if I can squeeze in. There were a couple more things I wanted to share, and then I'll hit the phone lines if people would like to share. I did want to get in quickly, though. I actually watched that entire episode of The Cosby Show, the March episode where Theo was doing this report on the March. I watched the whole thing, and there really wasn't even a side plot. That was basically the whole episode was around the March on Washington and them all telling stories about how cool it was to be there and all these white people that they met and got buttons from and all this foolishness. And I saw Rudy. Rudy is really young in this episode. Keisha Knight told me her real name. She's, 7 maybe, I don't know, something really young. And I'm thinking, man, if black people had any self-respect, if we had like an iota of self-respect, dignity, that's what we say all the time, black pride, Tyler Perry would be out of business like last week. He had Rudy as a prostitute in his film Medea Goes to Jail. I mean, just black people allowing that to slide at all. I mean, man, we have got to be super confused, not paying attention, drugged, something. I mean, that should be totally unacceptable. I mean, I know a lot of people love The Cosby Show, and just it's great to have Rudy as a prostitute. Man, he should be out of here like 50 years ago. I wouldn't care anything about for colored girls. Just that alone should be enough. Hey, you are out of here. We have no regard for your work at all. Hit the road, not going to see any of your plays, nothing. We don't want to see any more of anything that you come up with. Theater, books, nothing. Get out of here. But hope maybe that'll happen. I don't know. Maybe people missed that. I didn't even see the film, and I know, that's the role she had in Medea Goes to Jail. At any rate, I'll make sure I give out the numbers before I go to the next thing I want to share. Phone numbers, if you want to dial in at Blog Talk, it's 347-215-6071. If you are listening at War on the Horizon, we're simulcasting, you can dial the conference number, which is 760-569-7676, and the code is 948656. Okay. I will pick. I'm going to share. This is Chinweezu. And I guess, this is what I was doing before I was, really explicitly focusing on racism, white supremacy. I was basically just digging through the library and studying indirectly racism, white supremacy. I wasn't using that term yet, but, that's pretty much what it is. Chinweezu did an outstanding series of articles. This is all in the book Decolonizing the African Mind. I would highly recommend it. I found this when I read Urugu by Dr. Marimba Ani. He has a bunch of essays in here, but he has two in particular I'm going to do some bits of quoting from, and then I suspect I'll hit the phone line. But he has essays. This is in a chunk of the book that is titled Cultural Control Systems, right? Okay. And so he has essays on black people who get the Nobel Peace Prize. Just for the record, folks who would be in that category would be Nelson Mandela, Ralph Bunche, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Desmond Tutu, or President Barack Obama. Those are some of the folks who would be in that category, black people who get the Nobel Peace Prize. This is on page 175 of Chinweezu's Decolonizing the African Mind. And Martin Luther King Jr., he got the Nobel Peace Prize at the end of 1963. The march was a big part of why he got this prize, in my opinion. So he writes, that Nobel Prize brouhaha. What a brouhaha was kicked up by that Newsweek speculation about some African getting the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1985. When the hopes were dashed, somebody asked what I thought of the prize not having gone to this particular non-white male. Well, I was disappointed, actually. In my view, The Nobel Prize and this gentleman's literary works deserve each other. It would have been an excellent case of the undesirable honoring the unreadable. I certainly wish them both better luck next time. Actually, I've never thought much of the Nobel Prize. In Olympics, Nobel Prizes and the Black World, published in 1980, I spelled out why I consider it undesirable for Africans, namely its role as a bewitching instrument for Euro-imperialist intellectual hegemony, just the system of white supremacy, and the conceit that a gaggle of Swedes, all by themselves, should pronounce on intellectual excellence for the diverse cultures of the whole wide world. Likewise, I am not one of those who stand in uncomprehending awe before this particular black male's literary works, and the reasons are made clear in some of the other essays he's published. As for all the heartache in some circles, I don't see why any self-respecting African who understands the cultural role of the Nobel Prize should lust for a moment for the damn thing. The Pan-Africanist case against the Nobel Prize. An unexamined garment, they say, is not worth wearing. It could turn out to be a noose for leading us astray and strangling us. From the Pan-Africanist standpoint, every relation into which we were ushered at independence needs to be stringently evaluated. But many, alas, have not been. Only recently, following some passing remarks I made about its undesirability, did the pros and cons of Africa's relationship to the Nobel Prize become a matter of heated comment in the Nigerian press. The controversy makes it necessary to restate a Pan-Africanist case against the prize which I had put forward in 1980. Two principal arguments have emerged from those who think it desirable for Africans. They say an award to an African brings prestige to Africa, and that the African recipient could use the $200,000 in prize money, and that African countries could use the foreign exchange. But do these considerations outweigh the Pan-Africanist objections to the prize? But first, let the case be heard. To decide whether a prize is desirable or not, we need to look at the purpose for which it was set up and at the mechanisms for making the awards, especially the composition of the deciding committee. We also have to look at what kinds of works get it and what kinds do not, and what it encourages in aspirants. The basic Pan-Africanist case is that despite its universalist image, the Nobel Prize is not a genuine world prize. That is to say, it is not one organized by all of the nations, parochial minority of nations. I messed that sentence up. I'll read that again. That is to say, it is not one organized by all of the nations, administered by all nations, and free from domination by a parochial minority of nations. Beneath its universalist image, the Nobel Prize is, in fact, a local European prize. The standards applied in awarding it are European. The awards committees are European. And the awards are manipulated with full opportunistic regard for their role in fostering the hegemony of the West over the rest of the world. Racism, white supremacy. As Sartre said when he rejected the Literature Prize for 1964, the Nobel Prize appears objectively as an honor restricted to writers from the West or to rebels from the East, and needless to say, to fellow travelers from the Third World. For when bestowed on persons from there, the prizes have almost invariably gone to persons who have accommodated themselves to the Western white supremacist world outlook and served its interests. rebels against the West, and what it stands for rarely get it unless, as with Pablo Neruda and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, their dazzling achievement is such that to deny them the prize would betray the parochialism behind its universalist image. The pro-Western bias of the Nobel Prize may elude those who accept its image as the world prize without peer for excellence in the fields it honors. However, what is judged excellent are works which a committee of Swedes considers significant for Western values and Western power. Each category of the prize can be shown to operate in that way. The Peace Prize is for preserving the peace on Western terms or for engineering a battle truce on terms compatible with the interests of the West, or for limiting the damage to Western interests from insurrections by the oppressed. Thus, when rebellions seriously challenge Western hegemony and white racism, the Peace Prize is brought out to manipulate them into channels least threatening to Western white supremacist power. Cases in point are the awards to Martin Luther King, Albert Luthuli, and Desmond Tutu. When Martin Luther King was given the prize in 1964, he was in competition with Malcolm X for the allegiance of the Afro-American population. King was a Christian minister and the apostle of a nonviolent path to Afro-American emancipation from American racism. Malcolm X, in contrast, was a black Muslim minister who was beginning to gather opposition to the nonviolent campaign, which he diagnosed as futile. Naturally, Malcolm X's way was far more threatening to white America and to the interests of the entire Western world than King's. By giving King the Nobel Peace Prize, the establishment of the white West intervened in the Black Rebellion and gave a prestigious boost to the faction which they judged more tame and accommodating. The awards to Luthuli and Tutu were politically quite similar. Like King, these two were spokesmen for nonviolent, multiracial strand of opposition to apartheid in South Africa. They were in competition with leaders and factions which wanted, like Malcolm X, to fight apartheid by any means necessary and until the white settlers were driven into the sea. In Tutu's case, he competes with the ANC militants and the young urban rebels. Conferring the Nobel Prize on these moderate leaders was an intervention from the highest levels of the Western establishment to boost the prestige of the milder version of African rebellion and enable it to keep its hold on the populace. All that may seem like passive but strategic manipulation, but the active manipulation of Peace Prize recipients was recently exhibited in the Tutu case. While on a visit to the USA at the end of 1985, Tutu voiced support for the ANC and pointed out that the anti-apartheid campaign could sooner enter a more violent phase where black servants would poison their white masters. For airing such views, he was pounced upon by the U.S. leadership and by a chorus of white South Africans. George Bush, the U.S. Vice President, claimed that such talk cast doubt on Tutu's commitment to nonviolence. His standing as a Nobel Peace Laureate was said to be under a cloud. On returning to South Africa, Tutu found it necessary to qualify what he had said. He declared that while he agreed in principle with the ANC, he did not agree with its methods, that he was categorically against violence, and his statement had been an analysis of the situation rather than a recommendation of violence, etc. Thus was the good bishop tied up and restrained with the ribbons of the Nobel Prize. The West's interest in keeping their opponents nonviolent deserves to be understood. It is, after all, an ancient technique to saddle your opponent with a reputation which inhibits him from using his most effective weapon. Because the West is determined not to concede to anything but superior violence, It endeavors through propaganda to shepherd resistance into nonviolent paths. Using such emasculating honors, they can hold a leader captive within the futile options of nonviolence while going right ahead with their own violence. He, in turn, holds his followers in line and prevents them from joining those who fight Western violence with a counter-violence. Consequently, the armed opposition is smaller and the Western system is safer. I'm moving ahead in the article a few pages. It is thus that Eurocentric disorientation induced by the Nobel Prize divert some African writers and scientists from devoting their full energies to developing African science and literature. And it is thus that in every category, the Nobel Prize channels the efforts of aspirants and manipulates the laureates away from their Pan-African responsibilities, which is why the Nobel Prize should be regarded by the black world not as a badge of honor, but as a disorienting gift from our racist, imperialist foes, which is why it should be repudiated. In the light of the foregoing, can the arguments for the prize be upheld against the Pan-Africanist case? First of all, what good is a prestige which stuns and disorients us? It is not, it is not a neo-colonial equivalent of the OBE, which the British used to confer on those Africans whom our anti-colonial fathers dubbed the obedient boys of the empire. Blacks who crave the Nobel Prize, like those who crave the Obedient Boys of the Empire award, must be seen as camp followers of Western imperialism, white supremacy. Admittedly, we have long suffered world humiliation and insults, but does groveling for recognition from our insulters reduce or compound the humiliation? That's all I'm going to read from that essay, and I believe I should have time to squeeze in a tad from this other. I hope this is constructive. I read this, a while ago, and just looking back over it today, I thought it was very constructive. I thought it was something people should hear. I'll read a tad, and then I'll hit the phone lines. It says in late 1986, the intellectual and political elite of Africa reacted to the news from Stockholm as if it were an emancipation proclamation. It was as if the grand oracle of the culture, mouthpiece of the great white god of civilization, had announced that the black race had at long last become the intellectual equal of the white race, and that a Nobel to this particular black male was proof thereof. Like slaves hearing, they were free at last. They clapped, they shouted, they danced for joy. Some popped champagne and dived into bars and uttered amazing things. Those who could afford it trooped off to the great white altar of culture at Stockholm to be present at the immortal moment when the black race would receive its certificate of intellectual emancipation. Skipping forward, the pity is not that an undesirable prize has once again been tossed into our midst. Who can restrain the Swedish from rewarding certain Africans or stop? I'll skip that part. The pity is not that the prize was accepted with joy by the one whom it was bestowed. Can one really expect a N-word Tom to spurn a gift of laurels and bags of gold from the white massa in the big house? He goes on quite a bit. I'm skipping a little bit just because I do want to take calls. A lot of people called in, so I want to make time for that. Skipping a little bit, skipping. Man, this is, it's really, you should check it out. Just make sure you get the book. That's all you have to do. Go get the book, Decolonizing the African Mind. Just get the book. The last thing I'll read, He says, Stockholm is not the intellectual capital of the black world. It is not the venue for electing and anointing the intellectual leaders of the black world. The official voices of the West do not speak in the interest of the black world. Therefore, who in his right mind would consult them when choosing intellectual or any other leader for the black world? Again, I would highly encourage folks check out the whole thing because he goes more in depth with regards to the damage that prize can do in terms of confusion. But I'll check the phone lines to see if folks want to share. The number, if you want to call in at Blog Talk, is 347-215-6071, and the free HD line is open as well.
90.
The free HD line is open as well, so if you want to call in there, the number is 760-569-7676, and the code is 948656. So Blog Talk, you can call in quick there. It's 347-215-6071, and if you want to call in at the other number, it is 760-569-7676, and the code is 948656. The code again is 948656. If you are listening at Blog Talk Radio, you can migrate on over to waronthehorizon.com, and you can continue listening if you just want to hear the folks who called in what their comments are. It's waronthehorizon.com. Just click the live player, and you can listen live. Excellent audio quality. You can continue listening, no worries. I will hit the phone lines. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I hope you found the reading constructive, of some value, was not a waste of your Tuesday evening. Person who called in, last four digits, 5573. 5573, your line is open.
Oh, I was just calling in just because I seen that the show was about to go off air and stuff, so I just was calling in just to listen to, I guess, the full ending.
Oh, no worries. Thank you for
okay, but
listening.
It was a very informative and interesting show, though. I do want to thank you for bringing that information forward.
I appreciate it, sir. Thank you. I'm glad it was of some value to you. I appreciate it. If you want to comment or ask a question, just press 1, and I'll see that you have a hand up, and then I can get your call. Person who called in, last four digits, 8490. Did you have a question, or are you listening?
No, I'm just listening at this time.
All good. Thank you for calling in. Appreciate it. Person who called in, last four digits, 7012. Did you have a question?
No, brother. Guess I didn't have a question. But enjoyed the information you gave out. And I found it interesting, compare, because I never saw that Cosby Show episode, but and comparing that to something I think was read a couple of weeks ago on this show, how people were clapping and didn't hear anything, compared to what was said on the Cosby Show, the enthusiasm about being on the grounds, it's just pretty funny. And I'll definitely be hitting you up for that PDF file. And thanks again.
All good. Thank you for reminding me. And if you want that file, that article that I read. If you would like it, you can just shoot me an email, or some people shot me at Blog Talk. You can do that too. If you hit me at Blog Talk, like if you send me a message at Blog Talk Radio, you got to have your email address. Or actually, I'll tell you, I'll upload it, and then I can just send you a web address so you can access it. That's what I'll do. So don't even worry about it. Just shoot me an email or message or whatever, and I'll upload it so it'll be online, and you can just access it that way. So if you want that article, Castrated Giant, gotcha. And I'm glad you pointed that out because, what they said, what they presented on the Cosby Show, strong contrast. The article that I read a couple of weeks ago was Stranger in Babylon, where he said a lot of similar things as the reports that I read today about how it was a carnival atmosphere and the picnics and all that. And, just foolishness, total foolishness. If you would like that earlier article that I read, Stranger in Babylon, I can upload that one as well. So just let me know. And again, both of those articles are in Presence Africaine. If you are around a university or a college that has a great library, they should have those. I would highly recommend. Go flip through those. It is an African literary journal. They have articles and reports from all over the world, and it goes back to like the 40s. So, I mean, they have stuff on Malcolm X, Kwame Nkrumah. I mean, it is incredible source of information, and it still comes out. Like, they're still doing publications like it's current. So, Presence Africaine, I think if you're listening at Blog Talk Radio, you can see it scroll by. They have a lot of publications, so big ups to Presence Africaine. Person who called in, I think it's 7012. Did I just get you? 7012?
Yeah, that's me. You just got me.
Oh, my fault. I'm confused. Thank you. 8892. Did you have a question?
Is that me?
Yes, sir.
Oh, okay. No question. Just wanted to say that the program was very informative, you know what I'm saying, and very constructive today. The last article that you read about the Nobel Peace Prize, that very same thing could be said about today's Oscars.
Oh, nice, for sure.
The very same thing could be applied to that. Yeah. That's all I wanted to say, though. But enjoy the program.
For sure. Excellent point, sir. Excellent point. I would totally, anything that white people give out, I would say is pretty much, you're probably doing something to help them out. If white people do anything and they want to honor you and give you a biscuit or a bologna sandwich, you're probably doing something to help their system out. I would be real suspicious. White people generally don't do anything for me, so I might be stumbling in the correct direction, but yeah, Oscars, I think pretty much everybody that's got an Oscar, in my opinion, if you just look at the film that they got it for and their body of work, speaks for itself. Even Forrest Whitaker, unfortunately. I mean, Last King of Scotland is man. Excellent point. I didn't even think about that. Excellent point. He has that in Decolonizing the African Mind. If you get it, he has a bunch of essays in that same chapter. He talks about the Olympics, same thing. Like, excellent. I can highly recommend Chinweezu, Decolonizing the African Mind. Yeah, excellent point, sir. Excellent point. Let's see. Person called in from a blocked number. Gotcha.
Is that me?
Yes, ma'am.
Hey, how you doing? Oh, I'm just happy. You did very good work. Yeah, I know you don't like praise and stuff, but you did very good. I appreciate the research and
Oh, my bad. I'm sorry. My finger slipped. Just repeat what you just said.
Oh, I said I appreciate the research that you did and how you put it all together. Unfortunately, you may be crashing my section for the Cosby Show. But that's okay. I do remember that episode. And I just find it all really helpful, especially if we were to take this show and share it with some of the young people who may currently be getting indoctrinated with the false story in school. I remember my first experience knowing anything about Martin Luther King. I was 6 years old in the first grade, and they chose me to go across town to another elementary school to participate in some sort of march where we held banners and, we were told the whole typical story and everything. So it's really, really helpful and eye-opening to know the truth and the true backdrop to the story. So thank you.
For sure. I got your email. I got you. I will jingle you today. Give me like 2 hours.
Okay.
For sure. EbonyNewsChannel.blogspot.com. EbonyNewsChannel.blogspot.com. Mr. Nero, did you have questions, comments?
Gus, give me a moment to take off this.
You got it. Did you want me to come back in a minute, or you just need a couple seconds? It doesn't matter to me. Okay. Mr. Nero, did you want me to?
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. You're good.
Okay. No, I was listening, and I would certainly like a copy of the article if you could shoot that to me in email. I would appreciate that.
I would get
I won't say too much in regards to Martin Luther King, other than years ago, I used to call him Martin Lucifer King, but after listening to Mr. Fuller, I decided I shouldn't name call it. That was incorrect. So I stopped referring to him as Martin Lucifer King. But I will share this with you. I can remember as a child, my biological mother took me to UC Berkeley to watch the march and the I Have a Dream speech. And I can remember, watching all of that and looking at my mother and saying to myself, this is the same woman that carries a pistol in her purse, and she's got me watching black folk getting chewed on by dogs, not doing anything. So I was just very confused about that growing up, why she would bring us to that event and why she had such, fondness for, for the 60s movement, even though, she herself didn't march. But my mother was like, she was notorious in Oakland for carrying a pistol in her purse. So that's about all I'm going to say on it. I will allow those people that think otherwise to continue. They can continue to feel that way, or they can actually do some research on their own. But it never sat well with me, even as a child, watching someone march us to be chewed on by dogs and beaten by sticks. And to not do anything in response to it other than march and pray. Even as a child, it just felt like something was wrong.
I agree. Man, I just want to get this out there. Again, context, because people don't because most black people do not research. That's why I wanted to do this program. If you go back and read, particularly if you look after like 64, black people, not white people, black people were referencing Martin Luther King as Martin Loser King. Particularly if you start looking around the Watts riots, like 65, 66, black people were referencing him as Martin Loser King. He went to Watts to try and calm things down, and, they were like, get out of here. We are not on that at all. Roll. And he left immediately. And I'm not saying, name call, anything like that. He's a victim of white supremacy. I'm just saying you can go back real time and look, and a lot of his contemporaries were not pleased. They did not buy into that nonviolent philosophy, and they felt like, white people are using this guy to suppress our effort to combat racism, white supremacy. So, and they did a lot of name calling. So, I will get you on the PDF, though, Mr. Miro. No worries. And everybody else, got you. I'll upload it, and I'll get a link out so you all can hit it. You can download it yourself, or, whatever you want to do with it.
Yeah, that'll work.
No worries. Let's see. Other person called in from the block number with a hand up. Did you have a question, comment?
Hello, can I be heard?
Yes, ma'am.
Good evening to all of my listeners out there, as well as to you, Gus, and to Justice, and the War New Horizons staff and family. I am really enjoying this show. I've been out of communication for the past few days. I had to do some traveling, and I just got back in, so I've been getting caught up on what was going on for the past few days. And I'm really enjoying this show, so I'm very glad that you will be posting these articles on the blog, on your blog, so I can be able to download it. But what you were stating for years ago, I've come to realize the same thing with the Nobel Peace Prize, as well as our so-called leaders, black leaders that they've pushed up there and tell us to revere, especially with the Nobel Peace Prize, because the name alone that came from it, Alfred Nobel, the inventor of the dynamite, and the atrocious things that have been done to civilization by this person, and for him to set up a Nobel Peace Prize to award it to these so-called people, it should already make you suspect anyway about some kind of prize being awarded from this killer. And then when we have people like Desmond Tutu, because I have no respect for this person. First of all, he's a minister, and I've lost all respect from people who call themselves members of the clergy. So he definitely lost faith for me. And when all of the things start coming out about Dr. King and all of these so-called civil rights organizations and how they were funding and things of that nature, it just really and truly confirmed it for me. And I've just canceled all of my membership in the Urban League, the NAACP, and all of these other organizations. I just went ahead and canceled my association from them because I felt that why should I keep buying into something to keep oppressing me as well as other people of color? So I'm glad that you're publishing these articles, and I definitely will go out there and download them in order to add them to my collection that I already have out here.
For sure. Thank you for the support. Did you get the newspaper article? That's on my blog, too. Did you get that newspaper article from the Washington Post? I emailed it to you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you once again. I did get it. I was able to share it with my nephews over the weekend. So my family members, they're calling me. They said, okay, are you now going to become a black nationalist? And they were referring to me this weekend because I was on my lecture circuit with them trying to get them information. So I really and truly do appreciate it. Okay,
for sure. I'll when I get the stuff uploaded, I'll shoot you an email so you'll have a link so you can download the essays I read today and the one that I read a couple weeks ago. I'll shoot you an email, and I guess folks listen. I wasn't going to put it on my blog because it's big, but I might just do that. I might just have a link for it on the blog so you all can access it. I'll link it in the description for this show. That's what I'll do. That'll be easy. I'll put it in the description for this show so you all can just go back and look for this episode in the archives, and there'll be PDF files that you can just access right there and download or, whatever you want to do with it. Grooving. And the article that I was referencing with the female that just was on the line, it's a newspaper article. It's on my blog. I'm not reading it just because it's on my blog now, but and my blog is racism-notes.blogspot.com. That it's a newspaper article from the Washington Post. It's July 1963. It's like a month and a half before the March on Washington. And it supports a lot of, what we've already covered today. White people were really nervous. They didn't want the march to happen. They thought black people were going to come and act rowdy about racism, white supremacy, and they organized this meeting. White people organized this meeting in New York, got all these black people together, including Martin Luther King, changed what the march was going to be about, and, we got the results that everybody knows about. But it's on my blog. It's the most recent post, racism-notes.blogspot.com. First post up there. You can't miss it. You can read it right from the blog, and I think you should be able to print it out if you want it or download it or whatever. You can take it right off my blog. Person who called in, last four digits, 1996. 1996. Did you have a question or comment?
No, I'm just listening, Gus, but I want to thank you for all the information that you've been providing for us. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
For sure. Glad it has been of some value. You haven't wasted your Tuesday evening. Let's see. Person who called in 5301. Did you have a question, comment?
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Just wanted to thank you for the discussion tonight. Also, decolonizing the African mind. It was a reminder to somebody who somehow forgot to return it.
That's great.
And I'm looking forward to clicking by the blog and downloading that document as well. You're doing a great job, and continue doing what you're doing, winning a good fight.
Not winning yet, but
every one battle at a time.
I dig it. I will do so, sir. Thank you for listening in, and I'll get those files uploaded since people seem like they want to see those. I'll get those linked so you all can check that material out. Person who called in, last four digits, 4788. 4788. Did you have a question, comment?
Black Power.
Greetings.
I'm really enjoying this show. I've learned a whole lot, and especially about the March on Washington. And I really like what you said about the Nobel Prize also. And what came to mind when you talked about that was, it seems to me that the Nobel Prize is as much a message to the masses of black people as it is to the recipient. It's basically telling the masses, this is how you should act if you want our approval. And an individual that came to mind that they did the opposite to was Khalid Muhammad. Instead of praising him, it was like they tried to shame him in front of the world to show the masses of black people that this is not the way to do it, and this is the way to get our rebuke as opposed to our approval. That was all I had to add.
I would agree wholeheartedly. I think Robert F. Williams, I think, would be another example. There's a lot of them. Black people that are not doing what they want. I totally agree. It's shame, degradation, and ultimately violence. If they really, if you really get out of pocket. I would totally agree. And violence with Dr. Khalid Muhammad as well. Not just shame, ultimately violence. So, I completely agree. I would even argue Martin Luther King, when he got to the point where he was no longer of use to them and he was chatting a little too much about Vietnam and saying they shouldn't be over there harming those non-white people, violence as well. So, I would totally agree. Carrot and the stick type of thing.
I just wanted to clarify one thing. When I was saying about Khalid Muhammad, I was referring to when the U.S. Congress censored him. That was like the complete opposite of giving him a prize. So that was exactly I hadn't even thought about the fact that they killed the brother. I mean, of course, I know that, but I was more thinking about the fact that instead, that they went out of their way to vote to show their disapproval. To basically let us all know as a group, this is not the way to do it. You will never get our approval acting like this.
I agree.
I really love your show, brother. I'm just going to listen from this point on.
For sure. I appreciate it, sir. Thank you. Glad it was of some constructive value, for sure. I want to make sure I give acknowledgement because I could perceive Irritated Genie and perhaps some of the War on the Horizon gang snickering in the background. I believe Chinweezu would classify himself as a black nationalist and or Pan-Africanist. And I think he has a lot of constructive information. There are quite a few black people that have taken the stance that they are black nationalists that I would borrow quite a bit from. Chinweezu being one. There are many. I still would take my stance, but for sure, I would acknowledge that. Pan-Africanists who had brilliant analysis of the Nobel Peace Prize, the Olympics, just tons of stuff. I mean, get this book, man. It's Decolonizing the African Mind. Outstanding book. I actually read this by accident. I read this because I was trying to get The West and the Rest of Us, which is another book that he did. That book is cited in Urugu. I was trying to get that, and it was checked out, and this was available. So I just got this to tide me over it. I ended up loving it. Fantastic. You should probably get both of those, The West and the Rest of Us, and this is Decolonizing the African Mind. If you go to Paul Ifeanyi Grant, if you go to his website, he has quite a few essays and articles that Chinweezu did. You can check those out as well. Tremendous warrior scholar. I would highly promote his work. Actually, since we have a bit of time, I'll check back the phone line. I didn't get to James Foreman since people are they're okay with reading. I'm okay with reading, too. James Foreman, people should also read this book as well, The Making of Black Revolutionaries. Fantastic book. fantastic book, contemporary of all these folks. He was at the March on Washington and all that. This is he's actually in, if you watch the documentary, Negroes with Guns on Robert Franklin Williams, he's in that documentary, James Foreman, but he wrote The Making of Black Revolutionaries, and he also has a whole chapter devoted to the March on Washington. I'll take a hot second to share some of that, and then I'll double-check with the phone line to see if anybody has a final comment. And I want to end with, I want to give Malcolm X the final word, his speech message to the grassroots, just the chunk that he was talking about the march. But, yeah, this is from the chapter, The March on Washington, James Foreman. He says, "It was all very amusing to me and not of much importance, for I did not believe that a large march on Washington would accomplish much. But I felt that it was absolutely essential for SNCC to participate as one means of ending the isolation under which we had been working. We had to find more support in our fight against the racist white South. At the meeting, however, we insisted that the march had to include demonstrations against the United States Justice Department. Only recently in Albany, Georgia, the federal government, through the Justice Department, had brought charges of perjury against leaders of the Albany movement. There was no serious opposition to this idea, but somewhere later in the negotiations, the plan was dropped, unquestionably to satisfy the white liberal contingent. Following that meeting, there was another with Roy Wilkins. Baird Rustin wanted all of us to go into it, but I refused, saying that John Lewis alone should represent SNCC. I was sensitive to the protocol of the meeting, which supposed to be the heads of civil rights organizations, and did not want any snide remarks from Wilkins about double representation. My decision proved correct, for Baird Rustin and Cleveland Robinson later came walking out of the room to where I was waiting for John Lewis. Roy Wilkins had objected to their presence, adding that Baird Rustin represented zero. He even objected to the presence of Ralph Abernathy, but Abernathy had refused to leave and insisted that he had to stay with Dr. King. Notwithstanding this shaky start, the March on Washington proceeded to develop. Roy Wilkins and Whitney Young agreed to go along, and behind our backs, they and the Kennedy administration developed plans of their own as to how the March on Washington could be used to advance their own respective interests. The United States government as a whole worked diligently to make the march appear as one where black and white could come together in the democratic USA and peacefully protest. Uncle Sam's image was hurting from those Birmingham police dogs and fire hoses from photographs which traveled around the world of blacks kneeling in prayer for rights which the United States ostensibly denied no one, from the specter of violent rebellion that rose faintly on the horizon. SNCC, on the other hand, felt that the March on Washington had to be used to launch a blistering criticism of the society in general and to state some of the passion with which we had been working since 1961. The March on Washington had to be the form from which we articulated to the nation a militancy not heard before from the civil rights organization. In other words, SNCC's intent was running in direct conflict with the intent of the power structure and most of the march leaders. A blow-up was inevitable, but I didn't become fully aware of this until the last moment. Throughout the summer of 1963, I was busy with local protest movements in Atlanta, Rome, and Savannah, Georgia, Selma, Alabama, Greenwood, Mississippi, Danville, Virginia, Cambridge, Maryland. I was not involved with the development of the March on Washington after those first meetings in New York. Consternation first hit the nation's capital the day before the march when the speech John Lewis planned to give became known to some of the politicians flanking the Democratic Party. It was a stinger, and it had already been released to the press. I was sick with a cold and decided to go to bed early. At the Statler Hilton, I met Brother Malcolm for the first time. He had come to observe the march, which he would later term but false on Washington. We talked casually for a few minutes, and then I left to go get some rest. On the day of the march, the SNCC people gathered at the Statler Hilton, and we went as a group to the Washington Monument and from there to the Lincoln Memorial. We sang freedom songs to amuse ourselves and discussed the hypocrisy of the march. Everywhere, there were large groups from the labor unions and especially the United Automobile Workers, all with prominent signs. We had asked them for financial help, and they had refused. We felt that not only the UAW, but many other so-called liberal forces were shamming, and this was just another march. It would not solve the problems of the people we worked with. We talked of the expense involved in getting all these people to Washington and thought of our own desperate financial situation. We saw bus after bus full of people arriving, and our hearts grew sick. In Mississippi, we had been desperately trying to buy 2 cars, and we needed a few buses to transport people from place to place. Amid the affluence of the March on Washington, we became more bitter at the established civil rights groups and the white liberals who were fronting off black people. We talked about the poverty of the people with whom we worked and wondered when people, including civil rights organizations, were going to stop putting on displays of wealth such as what we saw now. We knew that many groups had large signs only for the benefit of the press and the television cameras. They had not done a damn thing for civil rights, and they certainly were not helping us in the Deep South. We also knew that Lewis had a dynamite speech that would puncture the tranquility of the march and the efforts of the Kennedy administration to make this look like a popular uprising in favor of his civil rights legislation. As I approached the top floor inside the Lincoln Memorial, I was met by Chuck Neblett and Matthew Jones of the Freedom Singers. Hey, man, did you hear what they did to John's speech? It was 1 p.m. The program was due to begin at 1:15. What do you mean? What are you talking about? They don't want John Lewis to give his speech. I started toward a group of march speakers. Very excited, my blood pressure started to rise. I knew that there was hostility to Lewis's speech and felt sure that they had pulled some trick. Now be calm, Abernathy said to me. We're going to work it out. Just stay calm, Jim. In a few minutes, enough of the story emerged to outrage me. The night before in the hotel, there had been a meeting of Bayard Rustin, John Lewis, Cortlandt Cox, and some other officials of the march. Archbishop Patrick O'Doyle, white person, had said that he would not appear on the platform with Lewis if John was going to say, as planned, that SNCC could not support the Civil Rights Bill of John Kennedy. There were some other objections to a section where Lewis planned to say that we will march through Dixie like Sherman, leaving a scorched earth with our non-violence. John had agreed to delete the section about Sherman from his speech. Other passages of not too much consequence were also changed. But new objections were being voiced, especially by Reverend Eugene Carson Blake of the National Council of Churches. Even the Archbishop was not satisfied. A committee was appointed to work out the differences. King, A. Philip Randolph, Ralph Abernathy, Bayard Rustin, Cortlandt Cox, John Lewis, Eugene Carson Blake, a representative from the Catholic Interracial Committee on Justice, and myself. The group closeted in a small anteroom on the top floor of the Lincoln Memorial. We of SNCC began to lecture them on the importance of John's speech and the suffering that speech expressed. I was furious, scornful, and deriding the federal government for all its inaction in places where we had worked. Meanwhile, outdoors, the speeches had to be delayed. Indoors, A. Philip Randolph began to plead for unity. Bayard Rustin started telling us that John's speech would take longer than the 5 minutes allotted to each speaker, although in the end, Dr. King spoke for 20 or more minutes about his dreams while black people lived in nightmares. Finally, we got down to brass tacks. Eugene Carson Blake objected to the fact that the words masses and revolution were used in the speech. He was afraid that people would label the march as communist. Even A. Philip Randolph had to speak out against that argument, saying that he used the word masses and also called for social revolution. Then came the key point. SNCC had agreed a day or two before to change Lewis's speech from saying we cannot support the Kennedy Civil Rights Bill to saying we cannot wholeheartedly support it because there were sections of the bill that members of our organization did support. This change was omitted from the text released to the press by an oversight. Now, however, Eugene Carson Blake began to object to the word wholeheartedly. We said that possibly we could change the phrase to read, we support with reservations. It seemed like a small matter to us then. We thought that Blake and others siding with him were just masturbating over words. At that point, the SNCC people decided to caucus separately. John Cortland and myself. We discussed the situation and found that we were not in a bad position. The press had copies of the original speech. Any deviation from that text was certainly going to call further attention to it and indicate disagreement. In addition, there were members of the press who already knew that there was conflict over the speech. We did not know at that time that Burke Marshall had leaked to the press a statement that the Archbishop would not speak if John's speech went unchanged. This might have made a difference in our approach, but we figured that the news coverage of John's original remarks plus portions of the actual speech and editorial comments on the dispute would put us in a favorable position. We then agreed that I should take all the changes they had agreed to the night before and that day and rework the speech. I felt that there were ways we could make the speech still stronger, reflecting more intensely our anger and frustration, our aspirations and hopes. After we did all that, we were not going to change one comma. If the church people didn't like it, they could go to hell. I started to work as fast as I could with the program starting before I had finished. I included the change to we support with reservations, and there was no further dispute. It would be years after the march, only after more experiences with the churches, especially at the time of the Black Manifesto, that it became clear to me why Eugene Carson Blake felt that change to be significant. It was not just quibbling over words, but a matter of substance, giving underlying purpose of the march. Somewhere along the line, the church and labor people had been told that this was a march to support the administration's civil rights bill, which was passed in 1964 after Kennedy's death. Who did this and how it happened, I do not know. But people all over the country thought they were marching for jobs and freedom, when in actuality, the sellout leadership of the March on Washington was playing patsy with the Kennedy administration as part of the whole liberal labor politics of Bayard Rustin, Roy Wilkins, A. Philip Randolph, Luther, Martin Luther King Jr., and the Catholic and Protestant hierarchy. If people had known they had come to Washington to aid the Kennedy administration, they would not have come in the numbers they did. Moreover, if I personally had any idea of the true purpose of the march on Washington, I would have resisted our participation in that march. In this context, it is clear why Blake and others preferred that we support with reservations if it was the intent of the Kennedy administration for the white liberals and sellout Toms to create a base of support, then to have apparent consensus of support for the Civil Rights Bill was important. It did not matter that one group supported with reservations. It supported nevertheless. If, on the other hand, we had said we cannot support wholeheartedly or we cannot support period, the whole game would have been shot. All this we did not, as I said, realize for some time to come, but we soon saw how the march was used by the U.S. government and the liberal labor syndrome to improve the American image abroad. The USIA film on the march, of which hundreds of prints were made, was shown all over the world as proof of how it was possible for peaceful dissent to take place in this country, how people exercised their democratic rights under this best of all possible systems. At the same time, the march served to stifle manifestations of serious dissent and to take the steam out of the black anger then rising in the South, eventually to explode in many parts of the North as well. We were beginning to see the whole process by which fancy productions like the March on Washington tended to psych off local protest and make people feel they had accomplished something, changed something somehow, when in fact nothing had been changed. I'm going to make sure I read that again clean. We were beginning to see the whole process by which fancy productions like the March on Washington tended to psych off local protest and make people feel they had accomplished something, changed something somehow, when in fact nothing had been changed. In 1965, the Selma to Montgomery March would confirm this feeling once and for all. Such marches could be compared to the anti-poverty program and other government-backed efforts with the veneer of popular participation. All are tools to subvert mass discontent and must be guarded against carefully. That is from James Foreman, The Making of Black Revolutionaries. I would highly recommend it. Excellent text. That is all the reading I'm going to do for today. I hope it was of constructive value. And I guess just to echo the last point that he shared in that book, that's why I said, we really don't want to be putting people up on a pedestal and jumping up and down about how this person is, world champion of counter-racism or black nationalism or what have you, because as I've said before, white people are very skilled at being able to manipulate black people and to get them to do things that ultimately support the system of racism, white supremacy. It is best just to scrutinize and pay close attention to what that person is doing and what the ultimate result is supposed to be. Don't get caught up in a lot of flashy words or even a lot of flashy deeds. Just what is the ultimate result? What is supposed to happen from this? I think if more black people had been asking that question, what is this march supposed to accomplish? What are we supposed to be doing? Things could have went very differently. That's what I would say, and anybody who thinks that this is just about bashing King, I could be coming out guns blazing. This was, like I said, this was something I spent a lot of time studying. I said before, I studied under Julian Bond, and they snickered and emailed me on my Facebook and said, that should be cowbells, Julian Bond, get out of here. Julian Bond, that is a lot of cowbells, and I had some suspicions about that even when I was very confused about racism, white supremacy, and taking classes from him. But Julian Bond does know quite a bit. I'm pretty sure you can go to Julian Bond and he could drop some gems on you about Robert Franklin Williams and some quite a bit of other information about racism, white supremacy, even though he is confused, a white sex offender. That said, I would just say, be very critical. I'm not into praising Martin Luther King Jr. I'm not into, bashing him either. I could be, really rolling up my sleeves and throwing, like I said, black people were referencing him as Martin Luther King during the 60s. Black people became very upset. In fact, if you read George Jackson's Soledad brother, he is griping about Martin Luther King and Bill Cosby. And I remember when I read that, and I was just like, wow, I think that was the first time Bill Cosby had, come out and made some statements about how, illiterate black people are, we can't speak correctly. And I was reading George Jackson like, wow, black people have been complaining about Bill Cosby for, 40 years. At any rate, as I said, it's not about bashing King. It's just about revealing truth and getting black people to be a little bit more informed about racism, white supremacy. I think white people continue to use the March on Washington to just cause confusion and to create this illusion that there are some good white people who, are down to support black folks and work against racism, white supremacy. And I just haven't seen any evidence that that's true. They can talk about John Brown all they want to. To my knowledge, that was, almost 200 years ago. We haven't had that many of them. Unless some other white people are willing to step up and get some guns and go crack some heads and go find enforcement officials who, executed Oscar Grant and all that, unless white people are willing to go do that right now, I'm not interested in hearing about all that. I'm not interested in singing any songs. I'm not interested in looking at any foolish archival footage from the March on Washington, how great a day it was, and camaraderie and democracy. Get out of here. Keep that in mind, too, what he just said. There's a reason you have all that archival footage from the march. You don't have, hundreds of reels of Robert Franklin Williams or the Deacons for Defense. You don't have hundreds of thousands of reels of them, but you've got, tons of footage of the March on Washington, speeches recorded and all that, easily accessible. There is a reason for that. I'll let it ride there. I will make sure to support War on the Horizon and plug some of their commercials, but I'm going to play the commercials, and then I'm going to wrap the program with Malcolm X, and he'll be the final word on the March on Washington. I hope the broadcast has been constructive. We should be back on Thursday with the black males from the Mean Girls of Morehouse Vibe article. These were the gay black males at Morehouse College. They should be dropping by Thursday evening. You just have to check back for show times and all that good stuff. But I'm quite excited about that broadcast. And make sure you have on your calendar Neely Fuller Jr. He'll be here on Tuesday, November 23rd, his 9th visit to the context of white supremacy, and that'll be simulcast at War on the Horizon as well. Thank you for tuning in. Justice's email address is justice.asap@yahoo.com. Again, it is justice.asap@yahoo.com. I'm going to play the War on the Horizon commercial, and then we will hear Malcolm X to close out the broadcast. Replace white supremacy with justice immediately, if not soon.
My wife, my child, go out back. This must never happen again.
Brothers and sisters, in honor of Black History Month, the first African insurrection musical in history is coming to Washington, D.C. That's right. War on the Horizon, in conjunction with Kamachi Industries, is bringing them Memphis boys, Brothers Keepers, to Washington, D.C. to do their nationally acclaimed play, 1831 Turner Street, on the life and times of the prophet Nat Turner. 1831 Turner Street is a place set in the modern climate of Black America. An elder meets a young brother and sister who are headed in the wrong direction. He steps in and provides parental guidance by teaching them about the life and times of Nat Turner the prophet. Black family, you'll laugh, cry, sing, and dance throughout the entire production. This play is for the entire Black family. Adults and children alike have agreed that this is the single best production they've ever seen live. 1831 Turner Street will be in Washington, D.C. on Sunday, February 20th, 2011, at the brand new Art Theater. In order to make this event all that it should be, we need your financial support. We're trying to raise $10,000 by January 31st, 2011. Any amount you are able to give will be applauded. Donations in the following increments will be accompanied by a gift of appreciation. $50 to $99, Part 1 of the Feminization of the Black Male series, our most popular DVD lecture on the condition of the Black male worldwide. $100 to $199, entertainment, Fighting the Poltergeist, a 3-disc DVD set containing over 6 hours of shocking information on the influence of Western media. $200 and up, the War on the Horizon Collection Series, an 8-disc DVD set which contains the entire Effeminization and White Sex series and more. To make your contribution, you can mail a check or money order to War on the Horizon, P.O. Box 54501, Washington, D.C. 20032-9101. You can call us toll-free at 877-927-0011 or 202-309-9106 to make a credit card donation by phone. You may also go to our website homepage, waronthehorizon.com/site, and click on the donate button at the bottom of the page to make a contribution via PayPal using your PayPal account, your credit card, or bank draft. For more information, you can look us up on Facebook under War on the Horizon. Black people, remember, at War on the Horizon, we didn't come here to be your friend. We came here to save you. And we look forward to seeing you on the battlefield. War on the Horizon, gotta love it.
Can't stand long for the color of a skin, take back like that. men uses these big guns or Negro leaders against the Black Revolution. They're not a part of the Black Revolution. They're used against the Black Revolution. When Martin Luther King failed to desegregate Albany, Georgia, the civil rights struggle in America reached its low point. King became bankrupt almost as a leader. Plus, even financially, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was in financial trouble. Plus, it was in trouble, period, with the people when they failed to desegregate Albany, Georgia. Other Negro civil rights leaders of so-called national stature became fallen idols. And if they became fallen idols, began to lose their prestige and influence, local Negro leaders began to stir up the masses. In Cambridge, Maryland, Gloria Richardson. In Danville, Virginia, and other parts of the country, local leaders began to stir up our people at the grassroots level. This was never done by these Negroes whom you recognize of national stature. They controlled you, but they never incited you or excited you. They controlled you, they contained you. They kept you on the plantation. As soon as King failed in Birmingham, Negroes took to the streets. King got out and went out to California to a big rally and raised about how many thousands of dollars. Come to Detroit and had a march and raised some more thousands of dollars. And recall, right after that, Wilson's attacked King, accused King and the Corps of starting trouble everywhere and then making the NAACP get him out of jail and spend a lot of money. And then he accused King and Corps of raising all the money and not paying it back. This happened. I got it in documented evidence in the newspaper. Roy started attacking King, and King started attacking Roy, and Thomas started attacking both of them. And as these Negroes of national stature began to attack each other, they began to lose their control of the Negro masses. And Negroes was out there in the streets. They was talking about, we're going to march on Washington. By the way, right at that time, Birmingham had exploded, and the Negroes in Birmingham, remember, they also exploded. They began to stab the crackers in the back and bust them upside their head. Yes, they did. That's when Kennedy sent in the troops down in Birmingham. So right after that, Kennedy got on the television and said, this is a moral issue. That's when he said he was going to put out a civil rights bill. And when he mentioned civil rights bill and the Southern crackers, not talking about they were going to boycott or filibuster to the Negroes, not talking about what? We're going to march on Washington, march on the Senate, march on the White House, march on the Congress, and tie it up, bring it to a halt. Don't let the government proceed. They even said they were going to go out to the airport and lay down on the runway and don't let no airplanes land. I'm telling you what they said. That was revolution. That was revolution. That was the Black Revolution. It was the grassroots out there in the street. Scared the white man to death. Scared the white power structure in Washington, D.C. to death. I was there. When they found out that this black steamroller was going to come down on the Capitol, they called in Wilkins. They called in Randolph. They called in these national Negro leaders that you respect and told them, hold it off. Kennedy said, look, y'all letting this thing go too far. And old Tom said, boss, I can't stop it because I didn't start it. I'm telling you what they said. They said I'm not even in it. Much less at the head of it. They said these Negroes are doing things on their own. They're running ahead of us. And that old shrewd fox, he said, well, if you're all on it, then I'll put you in it. I'll put you at the head of it. I'll endorse it. I'll welcome it. I'll help it. I'll join it. A matter of hours went by. They had a meeting at the Carlisle Hotel in New York City. The Carlisle Hotel is owned by the Kennedy family. That's the hotel Kennedy spent the night at 2 nights ago. Belongs to his family. A philanthropic society headed by a white man named Stephen Currier called all the top civil rights leaders together at the Carlisle Hotel and told them that by you all fighting each other, you're destroying the civil rights movement. And since you're fighting over money from white liberals, let us set up what's known as the Council for United Civil Rights Leadership. Let's form this council, and all the civil rights organizations will belong to it. And we'll use it for fundraising purposes. Let me show you how tricky the white man is. And as soon as they got it formed, they elected Whitney Young as the chairman. And who do you think became the co-chairman? Stephen Currier, the white man. A millionaire. Powell was talking about it down at the Togo today. This is what he was talking about. Powell knows it happened. Randolph knows it happened. Wilkins knows it happened. King knows it happened. Every one of that so-called Big Six. They know what happened. Once they formed it, with the white man over it, he promised them and gave them $800,000 to split up between the Big Six. And told them that after the march was over, they'd give them $700,000 more. $1.5 million split up between leaders that you've been following, going to jail for, crying crocodile tears for. And there's nothing but Frank James and Jesse James and brothers. Soon as they got the setup organized, the white man made available to them top public relations experts. Opened the news media across the country at their disposal. And then they began to project these Big Six as the leaders of the march. Originally, they weren't even in the march. You were talking this march talk on Hastings Street. Is Hastings Street still here? On Hastings Street. You were talking the march talk on Lennox Avenue. And not on what's called Fillmore Street. And Central Avenue. And 32nd Street and 63rd Street. That's where the march talk was being taught. But the white man put the Big Six ahead of it. They dimmed the march. They became the march. They took it over. And the first move they made after they took it over, they invited Walter Reuther, a white man. They invited a priest, a rabbi, and an old white preacher. Yes, an old white preacher. The same white element that put Kennedy in power. Labor, the Catholics, the Jews, and liberal Protestants. Same clique that put Kennedy in power joined the March on Washington. It's just like when you got some coffee that's too black, which means it's too strong. What you do? You integrate it with cream. You make it weak. If you pour too much cream in, you won't even know you ever had coffee. It used to be hot, it becomes cool. It used to be strong, it becomes weak. It used to wake you up, now it'll put you to sleep. This is what they did with the March on Washington. They joined it. They didn't integrate it, they infiltrated it. They joined it, became a part of it, took it over. And as they took it over, it lost its militancy. They ceased to be angry. They ceased to be hot. They ceased to be uncompromising. Why, it even ceased to be a march. It became a picnic, a circus. Nothing but a circus with clowns and all. We had one right here in Detroit. I saw it on television with clowns leaving, white clowns and black clowns. I know you don't like what I'm saying, but I'm going to tell you anyway, because I can prove what I'm saying. If you think I'm telling you wrong, you bring me Martin Luther King and A. Philip Randolph and James Farmer and those other three. And see if they'll deny it over a microphone. Oh, it was a sellout. It was a takeover. when James Baldwin came in from Paris, they wouldn't let him talk because they couldn't make him go by the script. But Lancaster, what the speech that Baldwin was supposed to make, they wouldn't let Baldwin get up there because they know Baldwin was liable to say anything. They controlled it so tight, they told those Negroes what time to hit town, how to come, where to stop, what sign to carry, what speech they could make and what speech they couldn't make, and then told them to get out of town by sundown. And every one of those towns were out of town by sundown. Now, I know you don't like my saying this, but I can take it out. It was a circus, a performance that beat anything Hollywood could ever do. The performance of the year. Luther and those other three devils should get a Academy Award for the best actors because they acted like the really love Negroes. They fooled a whole lot of Negroes. And the 6 Negro leaders should get an award, too, for the best supporting cast.